take a look at other news now. The Human Sciences Research Council, the HSRC, today hosted a webinar to mark the 65th year anniversary of the adoption of the Freedom Charter. So the event was titled Fighting for Freedom, the Charter 65 years on. Let's take a look at this now. Joining me from the SHRC is Dr. Joleen Steyn-Kotze. She's a senior research specialist there. Thank you very much to you, Doc. Thanks indeed for your time. So 65 years after the adoption of the Freedom Charter, I mean, one could argue that perhaps we should be discussing the Freedom Charter within the context of the conditions which we find ourselves in. In your view, how should we discuss the Freedom Charter today?
You know, I think when we start looking at the Freedom Charter and we kind of start looking at what the vision of the Freedom Charter was, it really brings forth, I would argue, kind of a vision or a legacy of what a post-apartheid South Africa needed to look like. And that vision was really founded on having human dignity for all. Human dignity, equality of opportunity, social rights, economic rights, as well as political rights. And I think when we start reflecting as we start moving towards that 30-year of democracy mark, we see on the one hand narratives saying we've achieved political liberation, but our liberation for human dignity still remains lacking. And those are the areas that we need to start reflecting on. Inequalities, inequality of opportunity, the impact of poverty and unemployment, and how that affects overall quality of life and life chance.
You know, so many years on, you did touch on that just very slightly, but do you think we have been true to the ideals of the Charter? I mean, for example, you know, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, if we could start there. Do you think we're true to what the intended purpose of this people's document was put together for?
You know, I think to a degree, one can make the argument and say, yes, when 1994 arrived, there was quite a lot of liberation euphoria. There was this sense of we are going to be a new country, a new people. But I also think there's a lot of misunderstanding that tends to happen. So when you start looking across various groups, for example, the meaning of 1994 that I found in one of the projects I work on called Delivering an Elusive Dream of Democracy was really very highly contested. On the one hand, you had a vision of having equal rights, social rights, economic rights, political rights. And on the other hand, you had a narrative saying, but we need to live in peace together. And I think ultimately that is the goal of living in peace together. But that cannot happen unless you start dealing with some of the structural issues that undermine the achievement of almost a form of social and economic freedom.
And I want to talk a bit about that. If you talk about, for example, equality, inequality, you've touched on that. I mean, a typical example of how someone can say we've not been able to be true to the ideals of the Charter, inequality remains. Let's just bring it a bit closer to where we are now. I mean, during South Africa's lockdown, for example, where we see black people in townships, in less affluent areas, seem to be continuing subjected to brutality, for example, of law enforcement agencies. That issue of violence, living in peace, is something that is true to what we see happening today and the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. How do we deal with that in looking at the Freedom Charter and saying, let's look at the circumstances that we have today? Have we made the kind of progress that we wanted to see happen when it was adopted?
No, I think, looking at especially the COVID-19 context and looking at the context of lockdown, lockdown in effect has really brought forth those fault lines of inequality, kind of those wicked problems, if you will, of inequality, of unemployment, of poverty. And I think to a large degree, it has also brought forth narratives of privilege, but not just based, I would argue, on race, but also on class as well, where more affluent areas, for example, were not necessarily subjected to some of the brutalities that we saw in less affluent areas. And I think the COVID-19 and the lockdown really creates that space for deep reflection on, yes, we've made progress towards some form of structural reform, and we've seen in the rollout of basic service delivery, albeit there are massive challenges in terms of equal access to those basic services. But on the other hand, kind of those apartheid spatialities still maintain. And I think that is going to be the next challenge moving on to the 30-year mark of democracy, is how we can really work towards that structural transformation that is necessary to form more of an equal opportunity type of society.
Dr. Steyn-Kotze, I really wanted to talk about, how we build a post-COVID-19 economy based on the Freedom Charter, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed for chatting to us this evening.